It began in silence. No headlines, no announcements, no flags raised. In the early 1960s, while the world's attention was fixed on Vietnam, another war was being born just beyond its border. A war fought without soldiers in uniform, without public acknowledgement, and without mercy. Its battlefield was Laos, a country the world had agreed must never become one. On paper, Laos was neutral. The Geneva Accords had declared it off limits, a nation untouched by the spreading flames of the Cold War. But in the shadows, Washington saw it differently. The Ho Chi Minh Trail, the lifeline that kept North Vietnam's war machine alive, cut straight through Laotian mountains and jungles. The United States could not bomb North Vietnam into submission if that artery remained open. And so, the CIA was ordered to find a way to fight where no one could know they were fighting. They called it the Secret War. There would be no medals, no public record, no official acknowledgement that it existed. The men chosen to run it didn't wear uniforms. They wore civilian clothes, carried no military IDs, and signed documents that would vanish if they were killed. Their mission was clear: turn Laos into a battlefield that no one would ever admit existed. In 1961, small planes began landing in mist-covered valleys deep in the Laotian highlands. They carried crates marked as humanitarian aid, but inside were rifles, ammunition, and radio sets. American pilots, hired through shell companies with names like Air America, began mapping the jungles from above. On the ground, CIA operatives met with tribal leaders who lived in the mountains, men who had fought for survival for generations and trusted few outsiders. Among them was a Hmong general named Vang Pao, proud, relentless, and fiercely loyal to those who kept their word. Vang Pao saw what was coming long before most Americans did. The North Vietnamese were already creeping across the border, turning villages into waypoints along their trail. He knew his people would be caught in the middle of a war they didn't start. When the CIA came with money, weapons, and promises, he accepted. In that moment, a secret army was born, one that would fight, bleed, and die for a cause that officially didn't exist. The CIA gave it a name that sounded harmless: Operation Momentum. But what it unleashed was anything but. From small beginnings, a few hundred mountain fighters armed with captured weapons, the Hmong army would grow into tens of thousands, supported by the most powerful air force in the world. The war that had no name was becoming the deadliest one no one would ever talk about. By 1964, the first airstrikes hit Laotian soil, villages vanished under clouds of smoke. American pilots flying unmarked planes dropped bombs on coordinates that were never recorded. In Washington, officials denied everything. On maps shown to the public, Laos was still peaceful, untouched, neutral. In reality, it was burning. The silence was the cover. The denials were the fuel. And behind them, the CIA's war machine was just beginning to move. What started as a whisper in the jungle was about to become a roar that would echo for generations. A war hidden in plain sight, buried beneath lies, and fought by men who would never see their names written in history books. Laos had become America's secret war zone, and no one was supposed to know. The sound of rotors echoed through the Laotian mountains like thunder trapped in the mist. Beneath the clouds, small aircraft skimmed through narrow valleys, weaving between ridgelines so sharp they could tear metal. The planes had no markings. Their pilots wore no uniforms. To the outside world, they didn't exist. But to the people of northern Laos, these strange machines carried both hope and the beginning of a nightmare. This was the birth of America's secret army, built not in barracks or training camps, but in the jungle itself. The CIA had found its ally in General Vang Pao, a Hmong leader who had already proven himself a master of guerrilla warfare. He was fierce, pragmatic, and utterly devoted to protecting his people. When the agency offered him weapons, supplies, and air support, he accepted without hesitation. His only demand, that his men be trained and treated as equals in this hidden fight. The first recruits came from mountain villages scattered across the plain of Jars. They were farmers, hunters, and fathers, men who had never seen an airplane or a typewriter, now holding American rifles and learning to fight a modern war. Their training took place at secret sites carved into the highlands, where CIA advisors drilled them in ambush tactics, radio communication, and the use of explosives. By day, the jungle echoed with the sound of target practice. By night, the same hills glowed with the orange flash of distant firefights. From these beginnings, a shadow army grew. The Hmong soldiers moved like ghosts through the fog, blending into the terrain that had raised them. They knew every trail, every hidden path, every mountain that could hide an enemy convoy. Armed with intelligence from CYA spotters and supported by American aircraft, they struck the North Vietnamese supply lines with deadly precision. The Ho Chi Minh Trail, once the North's unstoppable artery, now ran through a gauntlet of invisible fire. But the cost was steep. Each mission took lives. For every convoy ambushed, villages were bombed in retaliation. The North Vietnamese army, angered by the resistance, turned its fury on the Hmong population. The jungle began to fill with graves that had no markers, only memories. And still, the recruits kept coming. Fathers sent their sons. Mothers watched them leave, knowing they might never return. In Washington, officials spoke of Laos as if it were untouched by war. In truth, the fighting was intensifying every month. The Hmong army, codenamed the Special Guerrilla Units, had become the backbone of the CYA's covert operations in Southeast Asia. Their bravery was legendary among the few who knew the truth. They rescued downed American pilots, sabotaged enemy convoys, and fought hand-to-hand in terrain that devoured entire divisions. Their leader, Vang Pao, became a myth. His name was whispered among soldiers and spies alike. To the Hmong, he was a protector. To the CIA, he was a weapon. And to history, he would become the face of a war that never officially existed. By the late 1960s, the secret army numbered in the tens of thousands. Yet outside the mountains of Laos, almost no one knew they existed. Their deaths were unrecorded, their victories unacknowledged. The United States government had built an invisible army, one that could not be recognised even as it bled for them. In the silence of classified reports and blacked-out maps, the secret war was taking shape. Laos was no longer just a hidden battlefield. It was now home to an army that would fight, vanish, and be forgotten. The world still thought Laos was neutral, but the jungle knew better. It was alive with the sound of an invisible war. At dawn, the valley was hidden beneath a sheet of fog. From above, it looked like nothing, just another fold in the endless mountains of northern Laos. But when the mist burned away, the truth emerged. A city that wasn't supposed to exist. Airstrips carved from red clay, rows of tin-roofed huts, radio towers disguised as trees, the hum of engines that never stopped. This was Long Tieng, the secret capital of America's hidden war. Officially, Long Tieng didn't appear on any map. It had no coordinates, no postal code, no record in any government archive. But inside that invisible valley, the CIA had built one of the busiest airports in the world. Dozens of unmarked aircraft took off and landed each hour, ferrying weapons, supplies and men to outposts scattered across the mountains. Pilots called it Lima Site 20A. To those who lived and worked there, it was something else entirely. A world caught between civilization and chaos. By the late 1960s, Long Tieng had grown into a sprawling outpost of soldiers, spies and refugees. Hmong families who had fled the fighting built makeshift homes around the airstrip, their children playing between parked aircraft and stacks of ammunition crates. CIA officers moved through the crowds in civilian clothes, their faces sunburned and tired. Canteens served rice and beer to men who knew too much and said too little. Everyone there shared the same secret. They were part of a war that officially didn't exist. The airfield never slept. Pilots from Air America, the CIA's covert airline, flew constant sorties over the jungle. They carried supplies to remote mountain bases, evacuated the wounded, and dropped ammunition into firefights they could barely see through the smoke. The sound of their engines was the heartbeat of the secret war. Without them, everything would stop. Above the valley, the Ravens, unmarked spotter planes piloted by American volunteers, circled endlessly. Their job was to locate enemy convoys along the Ho Chi Minh Trail and call in airstrikes. They operated without uniforms, rank, or acknowledgement. If they were shot down, they disappeared from the record, erased like ink washed from paper. In the middle of it all was General Vang Pao, commanding his invisible army from a wooden hut near the runway. His word could launch an airstrike or save a village. He met with CIA handlers, tribal leaders, and foreign pilots under the same roof, chain-smoking while maps of the region covered the walls. Around him, the war pulsed like a living thing. Planes taking off, shells exploding in the distance, radio chatter in 3 languages at once. Long Tieng became a crossroads of the impossible. Refugees arrived by the hundreds each day, seeking safety from the bombing raids. CIA officers trained new recruits and kept lists of those lost in combat. The valley filled with graves marked only by stones. And yet the machine kept running, hidden, humming, relentless. The rest of the world had no idea this city existed. Reporters who tried to find it were turned away or told it was a myth. In Washington, when questioned about CIA activities in Laos, officials simply denied everything. Long Tieng didn't appear on paper, and that made it perfect. By night, the valley glowed with faint lights under the mountain mist. The air smelled of jet fuel and rain. Men who didn't officially exist climbed into planes that weren't supposed to be there, bound for missions that would never be acknowledged. Long Tieng was more than a base. It was the beating heart of the secret war, a city of ghosts, fueled by secrecy and fated to vanish the moment the truth came out. The sky above Laos was alive with ghosts. From the ground, they looked like birds of silver cutting through the clouds, silent and unmarked. But to those who fought in the jungle below, they were angels and demons both, unseen, unheard, and lethal. These were the Ravens, the covert pilots of America's hidden air war, and they flew where no one else dared. Their orders came in whispers, their missions never written down. Officially, they were civilian advisors. In truth, they were fighter pilots stripped of insignia and rank, flying light aircraft with no identifying marks. Their job was to find the enemy, mark targets for bombing runs, and guide in the airstrikes that rained destruction across the Laotian countryside. They flew close enough to feel the heat of explosions and the wind from their own rockets. Every mission was a gamble. Every crash, a secret buried under jungle vines. The Ravens lived out of duffel bags and whiskey bottles. They slept on cots beside their planes, always half ready for the next call. Most were volunteers from the US Air Force who had grown tired of regulations and wanted to fight on their own terms. They got their wish. In the mountains of Laos, there were no rules, only targets and survival. Each morning, as the mist lifted off the valley, they would climb into their small Cessnas and take off from Long Tieng's red dirt runway. The air vibrated with the hum of propellers and the crackle of radios. From above, the jungle looked deceptively calm. Endless green hills hiding a network of enemy convoys, bunkers, and anti-aircraft guns. The Ravens flew low, sometimes so low they could see the faces of North Vietnamese soldiers looking up at them. When they spotted movement along the Ho Chi Minh Trail, they called in the bombers. Jets screamed in from Thailand, their payloads falling like iron rain. The ground shook, trees vanished in clouds of dirt, and the air filled with the sound of thunder that never stopped. From the cockpit, the Ravens watched the world disappear in fire and smoke, then turned their planes back toward base, only to do it all again an hour later. They were reckless, fearless, and half mad from the pace of it all. Some kept count of their missions, others didn't bother. They joked that they wouldn't live long enough to retire. The jungle claimed planes every week. Engines shot out, wings torn off by ground fire, pilots lost with no trace. When a Raven went down, there was no rescue team, no announcement. Just a pause in the radio chatter, and then silence. The Hmong fighters on the ground worshipped them. They called the Ravens sky warriors, men who could summon fire from the heavens. But the truth was darker. The bombing was relentless, far beyond anything the world would later believe. In less than a decade, the United States would drop more bombs on Laos than it had on Germany and Japan combined. Entire villages vanished, and the soil itself turned to dust. Yet through it all, the Ravens kept flying. They believed they were holding back the tide, that their work in the skies of Laos could tip the balance of the Vietnam War. They flew without recognition, without protection, and without the illusion of victory. Each sunset over Long Tieng cast a red glow across the mountains, painting the clouds with the same colour as the earth below. For the men in the sky, it was a reminder. They were fighting a war no one would ever see, in a place that didn't exist, under orders no one would ever admit. And still, the planes kept flying into the fire. The first bomb fell on Laos in 1964. By the time the last one dropped 9 years later, the country had been hit more than any other place on Earth. Every valley, every river, every village was marked with craters. To those who lived there, the sky itself had become the enemy. At its height, the bombing was relentless. American aircraft flew day and night, their paths traced across the horizon like burning lines in the clouds. The roar never stopped. It became the sound of life in Laos. The hum of engines above, the whistle of falling metal, the deep thud of explosions rolling across the jungle. It was called Operation Barrel Roll, a name that sounded harmless, almost playful. But for the people below, it meant death from above, delivered by machines that no one had ever seen before. The mission was simple: destroy the Ho Chi Minh Trail. But simplicity and reality rarely matched. The trail wasn't a single road, it was a labyrinth. Hundreds of paths cut through the jungle, repaired and rerouted faster than bombs could destroy them. For every crater made, the North Vietnamese carved a new way through. So the bombing grew heavier. Bigger payloads, more sorties, more fire. Villages disappeared overnight. Rice fields became seas of mud and twisted metal. Children grew up not knowing silence, only the trembling earth and the burning sky. Farmers ploughed around unexploded bombs. Families dug shelters into hillsides, living in the dark for weeks at a time. The war had turned the land itself into a weapon. From the air, pilots saw only targets, small dots that moved, convoys that glowed on radar. But from the ground, it was a different world. The Hmong soldiers who fought alongside the CIA watched their homeland vanish piece by piece. They fought for the Americans, guided their aircraft, carried out raids against enemy supply lines. Yet with every passing year, the lines blurred between ally and victim. The same airstrikes that crippled the enemy also shattered the homes of the people who fought for the United States. The statistics were staggering, but statistics meant nothing in the jungle. What mattered were the sounds, the endless hum of engines, the sudden scream of falling bombs, the ringing silence that followed. The war had no front lines anymore, only zones of destruction that shifted like shadows. By 1970, northern Laos had become a wasteland. Satellite photos showed entire regions erased from the map, turned into fields of craters visible from space. Pilots joked that if you missed your target in Laos, you just had to wait 5 minutes. Another plane would hit it soon enough. For the CIA officers on the ground, there was no time to reflect. The bombing was a machine, and it had to keep moving. When the monsoon came, the rain filled the craters, turning them into shallow lakes that glistened beneath the grey sky. From above, the land looked beautiful again, dotted with silver pools among the green hills. But those lakes were graves, silent reminders of what had fallen there. By the end of the secret war, more than 2 million tons of bombs had been dropped on Laos. Many never exploded. They still wait in the soil, buried under the grass and roots, killing farmers and children decades later. The war that no one talked about never truly ended. It just went quiet. Laos had become the most bombed country in human history, and most of the world still didn't know it had ever been bombed at all. By 1973, the silence around Long Tieng had turned heavy. The radio chatter had thinned, the airfield that once roared with engines now echoed with uncertainty. The war that wasn't supposed to exist was collapsing, and everyone in the valley could feel it. The Americans were leaving Southeast Asia. Vietnamization, peace accords, ceasefires, all the words that meant the same thing. The end was coming, and those left behind would have to face it alone. Supplies slowed to a trickle. The flow of aircraft from Thailand grew smaller by the week. Ammunition was rationed, fuel was precious. Men who had once fought with fierce pride now looked toward the horizon, wondering when the next helicopter out would come for them. General Vang Pao still walked the airstrip every morning, still gave orders, still promised his people they would not be abandoned. But even he knew the truth. Without American air power, the Hmong army was finished. The North Vietnamese were closing in from the north and east, their divisions moving through the highlands like a tightening fist. Each day brought more refugees to Long Tieng, women, children, old men carrying what little they had left. The valley that once buzzed with aircraft and intelligence briefings was now a refugee camp clinging to the edge of a dying war. The CIA officers at Long Tieng worked quietly, burning documents, packing equipment, destroying records that were never supposed to exist. Air America pilots flew their last missions with grim faces. They knew what was coming. Each takeoff carried more than supplies. It carried the weight of guilt, of promises made to people who had fought and died under a flag that wasn't theirs. Then came the first artillery shells. They fell in the early morning, rolling through the valley with a low rumble that shook the tin roofs. Smoke rose over the hills. Panic spread fast. Civilians rushed to the airfield, hoping to board planes that were already full. The once secret city became chaos. Gunfire, crying, engines straining under impossible loads. The mountain walls that had protected Long Tieng for a decade now trapped its people inside. As the shelling grew closer, the evacuation began. The code word was simple: clean sweep. Every American and select Hmong officers were to be flown out. Everyone else would be left behind. The pilots worked without rest, flying overloaded aircraft off the dirt strip, their wings barely clearing the trees. Children clung to their mothers. Soldiers begged for space. Men who had risked their lives for years were told there was no room left. By nightfall, the valley glowed orange. The last radio tower was destroyed, and the maps of Laos were burned. When the final plane lifted off, Long Tieng was left behind, its lights fading beneath the wings, its people watching from the ground as the sky swallowed the last sign of escape. Vang Pao boarded one of the final flights. He looked down at the valley that had been his home, his fortress, his dream. Below him, the jungle swallowed the city once again, erasing the traces of a war that had never been meant to exist. When the North Vietnamese arrived, they found nothing but silence. The airfield was empty, the huts were deserted. The secret city had vanished back into myth. Long Tieng had fallen, not with a final battle, but with a quiet exodus into history. The heart of America's secret war had stopped beating, and those left behind would now carry its echo for the rest of their lives. When Long Tieng fell, the jungle swallowed the sound. The engines were gone, the airfield empty, the sky silent for the first time in years. What followed was not peace, but pursuit. The Hmong who had fought for the Americans, the men, women and children who had trusted every promise, were now hunted. In the hills of northern Laos, word spread quickly. The North Vietnamese army was coming. Villages that had once echoed with laughter emptied overnight. Families gathered what they could: a handful of rice, a blanket, a picture, a weapon. They left behind homes carved into the mountainsides and moved quietly through the jungle, guided only by fear and memory. The trails that once led them to battle now led them away from it. The exodus began as a trickle, then a flood. Tens of thousands of Hmong families fled south toward the Mekong River, the border between Laos and Thailand, the last hope for survival. They travelled through monsoon rain, their clothes soaked, their feet torn by stone and root. Many carried infants on their backs, the sound of crying muffled under palms to avoid detection. At night, the jungle pulsed with danger. Enemy patrols, wild animals, hunger. Those who fell behind were lost forever. The jungle became a graveyard. Streams ran red with the blood of those ambushed or drowned in the current. Some villages never made it past the mountains. The elderly died along the path and were buried beneath shallow mounds marked by sticks. Parents whispered prayers over small bodies before moving on. Survival meant not looking back. On the far side of the Mekong, Thai soldiers patrolled the banks. Refugees risked everything to cross, swimming under the moonlight, clinging to bamboo rafts, dragging the wounded through the current. The river was wide, fast, and cruel. For many, it was their final resting place. Those who made it across were herded into camps surrounded by barbed wire. They were safe, but they were not free. In those camps, the war lingered. Disease spread, food was scarce, families were separated for months, sometimes years. Children were born who would never know the mountains their parents came from. The Americans who had promised protection were far away now, their war finished, their memories fading. The Hmong were left with silence and loss. A few were eventually resettled abroad, in the United States, France, and in Australia. They arrived with nothing but their stories, their language, and their grief. Many couldn't explain where they had come from, because the war they fought in was one no one was supposed to know. They became the invisible veterans of an invisible conflict, their sacrifices buried beneath politics and secrecy. For those who stayed in Laos, the years that followed were filled with fear. The new government branded them traitors, enemies of the revolution. The mountains that had once sheltered them became traps. The Hmong learned to live like shadows again, hiding in caves, moving by night, teaching their children to be silent. The war was over, but it never really ended for them. The exodus of the Hmong was one of the great tragedies of the 20th century, a movement of a people erased from the very history they helped shape. They had fought for a promise that vanished in smoke. They had built an army for a country that denied it ever existed. When the last of them crossed the Mekong, they looked back at the land they had called home. The jungle stretched endlessly, green and unforgiving. Somewhere beneath it lay Long Tieng, their city, their memory, their lost heart. They walked on, carrying the weight of a war the world refused to see. Years passed, and the jungle reclaimed the scars. The bomb craters filled with rain. The airstrips vanished beneath vines. The trails where the Hmong had marched grew quiet again, overgrown and unmarked. The war that had consumed an entire generation was buried under green silence, erased not by peace, but by denial. In the United States, the secret war in Laos was barely mentioned. It appeared in no speeches, no textbooks, no memorials. Even among veterans, it was a rumour, something whispered about in bars, hinted at in coded phrases, dismissed as legend. The CIA called it a covert operation, and the words did their job well. They turned a decade of destruction into a footnote. But the silence could not hide the truth forever. When the first journalists and aid workers returned to Laos in the late 1970s, what they found defied belief. Fields were pocked with thousands of bomb craters. Children played with unexploded ordnance as if it were scrap metal. Farmers unearthed cluster bombs when they tilled the soil. The war had ended, but its weapons had not. Every day, new explosions echoed across the countryside, killing farmers, maiming children, destroying lives long after the bombers had gone home. The statistics finally surfaced. More than 2 million tonnes of explosives had been dropped on Laos, the equivalent of one plane load every 8 minutes for 9 straight years. It was the most intense bombing campaign in human history, waged in a country that had never declared war on anyone. Half of those bombs never detonated. The land itself had become a minefield that would take generations to clear. Meanwhile, the survivors tried to rebuild what had been lost. Hmong families scattered across the world told their children stories of mountains that no longer belonged to them, of rivers crossed under gunfire, of a city in the clouds called Long Tieng that no one could find on a map. In Minnesota, California, and Wisconsin, the first Hmong communities began to grow. Farmers learning city life, soldiers turned refugees, haunted by a war they could not name. In time, the truth began to emerge. Declassified documents, eyewitness accounts, and forgotten photographs revealed the scope of the secret war. Historians uncovered the layers of deception, the denials, the false reports, the erased flight logs. What had once been invisible began to take shape. A war fought entirely in the shadows, paid for with the blood of people who were never meant to be remembered. Even today, the land bears the scars. In the remote hills of Laos, bomb clearance teams still comb through the soil, marking every piece of unexploded metal with red flags. Entire villages live with the knowledge that one wrong step could mean death. The sound of detonations still echoes across the valleys, the echoes of a war that refuses to die. The secret war in Laos remains one of history's most haunting silences. It was a conflict born in secrecy, fought in darkness, and buried beneath politics and shame. Yet its consequences live on, in the scars of the land, in the memories of the Hmong, and in the quiet fields that still whisper with the ghosts of the past. The war no one was allowed to mention became the war no one could ever forget. And in the quiet valleys of Laos, where the earth still trembles from the past, the truth lies waiting, just beneath the surface, like an unexploded bomb, waiting for the world to finally listen. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this story, leave a comment below. I always read what you think. Hit like if you learned something new, and subscribe so you don't miss the next untold story of war, courage and survival. Turn on the bell for more history brought to life. See you in the next one.